Welcome to the 11th conversation with the Chancellor. I'm Mayo Moran. I am the Provost of Trinity College, and it is wonderful to welcome all of you tonight to what I think is going to be a really fantastic, fascinating evening. As you will know, we have with us tonight the National Chief of the AFN, Perry Bellegarde, and he will be introduced by our wonderful Chancellor, Bill Graham. This is the 11th, as I said, in this series, and there have been some really incredible conversations. Joe Clark, Louise Arbour, Rick Hillier, and I know that tonight's conversation will only raise that bar, so we're all looking forward to it. And before we get going, I would just like to acknowledge also that we have with us here tonight Chief Brian Laforme, and to thank him for graciousness. We are on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit, so I wanted to acknowledge Chief Laforme. And with that, to hand it over to the Chancellor and to the National Chief for another night of wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Provost. Thank you. Thank you, Provost. Well, perhaps, National Chief, you won't mind if I don't spend a lot of time introducing you, because we've got so many things I want to talk to you about that I don't want to lose a minute. No. And we'll wrap up about your great qualifications. All right. Afterwards, you're going to prove your qualifications in the course of the evening. But it's a great privilege to have you here. You've been what, 6 months in the job now?
3 months.
3 months in the job now. You traveled across the country, and you told me earlier, how many chiefs did you have to visit to?
633 in Canada.
633, and all over this country. It's really remarkable. It's extraordinary. And I think you got well over 60% of the vote on the first ballot.
63% of the vote on the first ballot.
So, yes. Speaking for some of these, so there might be the odd young political aspirant in the room. Just take note. We've got an expert here, someone you can consult after. But I'm going to start by asking you about this morning. This morning, you've come straight from Ottawa. You were appearing before a parliamentary committee this morning on Bill C-51, and we talked to some of the people who were at dinner with us, who saw you, watched what was going on in the House. Tell us your position on C-51 and why it is you got the perspective you do.
Good question, Bill. And ni stamina pictuit ne heo on obsisi. Ni stamina Perry Bellegarde sega seo. Kuskate maskus uskunagun sega seo. Ogimau pie seo sega seo. I just want to say a little bit in Cree. I speak a little bit Cree. I said my name and my Indian name. I always start off with that. Just the importance of language, Indigenous identity, and because that's so important to us as First Nations people in Canada. And I just want to say, it's a great question, Bill C-51, but it's my honor and privilege to be here as well at Trinity College and to share this evening together to talk about some very fundamental issues, concerns to all of us, and how we really work together to build a better Canada as First Nations people and non-First Nations people. So Bill, to you and to Mayo, and for the wonderful evening, I just wanted to say that first before we get into the text. And then we'll get into the rah-rah and the questions here, no question. But I wanted to say that much. And, so back to the question, Bill C-51. And this morning, I did make the presentation on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations. And Bill C-51, as you know, is a proposed law that's being brought in. And I spoke to the parliamentary committee and made a very clear request to withdraw the bill. Because
perhaps we should indicate for those who are not in the room, C-51 is the new anti-terrorism legislation. So
yeah, and I didn't want to get into any kind of a debate or dialogue about tweaking it or fixing this clause or this. It was just more. For us as First Nations people, we have our rights protected in Section 35, and there's a lot of lawyers here. And so existing Aboriginal treaty rights in Canada's Constitution, and anytime there's any kind of legislation that's being proposed, and we always hear these things, honor of the Crown. We also hear these things called duty to consult and accommodate. And then we kick it up a notch and we refer to free, prior, and informed consent within the UN Declaration. And so when we start talking about any proposed legislation that's coming down from the Crown that has or may have an impact on those constitutionally protected rights, we're saying, hey, were we notified? No. Did we have a chance for involvement to dialogue about it? No. So therefore, you're breaching your own constitution, and it's flawed. And if it does get passed into law, we will look at challenging that based on the Section 35 provision. And that was the point I was trying to make this morning.
So really, I mean, I think it's a very interesting perspective, because we've been looking at it as a civil rights issue, privacy issue, but nobody really, apart from yourself, has tied it to Section 35 of the Constitution, and then into the broader picture of what are the protections of Indigenous rights in Canada, and how are they to be protected. And so you're managing to take this bill and saying it could be used in a way to interfere with your way, you're able to protect your own rights.
I tried to give the example as well, and I referred to northern British Columbia with the flooding in C, yeah. Mount C, or flood, what's the right word? Site C? Que guayo, man. Site
no
C.
Cheating now.
No. What's that word? Cree, I said, que guayo, man, what is that? Site C, the flooding, and I gave the example, like, will those chiefs in that territory that are going to stand up and say, hey, you're flooding 100 acres of our traditional territory. We used to hunt and trap and gather. You know, so if those chiefs get up and say, hey, no more flooding here, will they be classified as terrorists? You know, under Bill C-51, there is that possibility that they would be. Then I went on to give it another example in northern Manitoba, the Sapotawiak chief, you know, where they're starting to clear cut. And they used to hunt and trap and gather in that area as well. So will they be classed as terrorists if they say, hey, no more clear cutting? And the same thing with the fracking issue on LC Buktuk. Will they be classed as terrorists? So when we start looking at it from that perspective of Section 35 rights, they would not be able to exercise their treaty right to fish or hunt or trap or gather, you know. So that's why I say we make the connection to the Section 35.
No, it's a very interesting.
It's just, there's no way that they could exercise
And you
that.
have told me that there are cases where, in fact, people trying to protest these sorts of developments have been followed by the police and treated as if they were engaged in criminal activity.
Well, the other example I talked about was Cindy Blackstock, we always say is one of our heroes, and we're working on a case with her through the Assembly of First Nations that deals with childcare on reserves. And the case we brought before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, you know, we're proving that Canada is acting in a discriminatory, racist way, because on reserve, again, it's for childcare, for basic fundamental services for children. You know, the services are way down here, but yet in the provincial childcare system, they're way up here. So we're making the case, you know, to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that it really is a discriminatory practice, discriminatory funding that they're doing. But because of the activism, the political activism that's occurred, Cindy has been targeted. She's been followed. She's been monitored. Her emails, her phones, wherever she goes to speak. You know, there's people from government agencies, from CSIS, tracking her. So that's another example, even without Bill C-51,
right,
when people are starting to stand up for their rights, and the government will just come in and do this. So there's that risk, again, of privacy. There's a risk of infringement of even personal security. Like, all those things come into play. But this morning with Bill C-51, I didn't even want to go there. Yeah. There was a bigger piece that, it's a flawed piece of legislation. I should withdraw it. And I'm asking the Crown, because there's other flawed pieces of legislation, the omnibus bills, Bill C-38, Bill C-45, that are flawed pieces of legislation. And they will be challenged. And there's a number of First Nations across Canada that are looking at legally challenging it.
You certainly have got, in a very short period of time, a very good sense of the architecture of what's going on up in Ottawa. So this is very encouraging to know that you're there. But maybe if we could move to some other issues. One of the major planks in your campaign to be National Chief was increasing Indigenous access to the revenues and jobs arising from resource development. Mm-hmm. And obviously this is something this ties into environmental issues, it ties into fairness and justice in terms of resource sharing. Mm-hmm. How do you see that file developing at this time? I mean,
well, with resource revenue sharing, what I always begin with, Bill, is when I start talking about the situation in Canada, And Canada is a beautiful, rich country to live. In fact, it's one of the best countries in the world to live. And I always quote the United Nations Human Development Index. It's rated 6th up here. But when you apply the same indices to Indigenous peoples, we end up being 63rd down here. You know, so that's right. What this represents.
Ranked in countries. Like we're number 63.
Yeah. So 6 versus 63rd. Wow. There's a huge socioeconomic gap that exists. And this gap represents the overcrowded housing. This gap represents the lack of access to good education systems. This gap represents the disproportionate number of First Nations people in the jail system. This gap represents the high numbers of children in care and provincial care. It represents the high youth suicide rates. All those negative things. There's a huge gap. Access to potable water, basic fundamental rights. So it's 6 versus 63rd. And so when you look at this country, and when you look at the vast amount of land and resource wealth that's there, as Indigenous peoples, we say we're to mutually benefit and share from the bounty. We're to mutually benefit and share from the land and resource wealth. Peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between our peoples is how we were taught. Right. And when we see this gap, it's not acceptable. And so a concept that I've been talking about for years now is that we didn't give up everything. We didn't give up all the land and give up all the resources. We said we'd share. And so to close this gap, you know, one of the things we've been always espousing is we should be benefiting directly ourselves as Indigenous peoples from the resource wealth, right? So resource revenue sharing, we don't want it all. But to help close this gap, we need access. And there's also a legal, historical, and moral obligation, constitutional obligations. And so the timeline that I go through, when I always talk about this, and I talk to the premiers, I talk to the different federal government leaders, industry leaders, it goes, and I always go to the doctrine of discovery. This is going to be my timeline now, so constitutional lawyer, you'll know what I'm going to be talking about.
Be careful,
here.
he's going back to the 15th century here.
I am. Because this doctrine of discovery, because I always say, how did the crown, or assumed crown sovereignty, I'll use that word, assumed crown sovereignty. And that's where I begin, this doctrine of discovery. Now is being challenged as an illegal and racist doctrine, you know, and the papal bulls and all those things that have to be repealed, you know, because this doctrine of discovery, you know, I begin there, because it starts with that. Because how else can you gain title to land and territory if nation states are utilizing that doctrine of discovery? It's starting to be challenged. So we'll start there. And then from there, I go to this thing in the Mabo decision, terra nullius, vacant land. Well, the land wasn't vacant in Canada. There was many different nations here, over 58 different nations. And so I always say in a respectful way, was Canada really founded on 2 founding nations, French and English? And I said, no. Yeah. There was a lot of other Indigenous nations here that had a hand in it. So, Doctrine of Discovery, terra nullius, Royal Proclamation of 1763, the first time that the Crown recognized Indians' title to land and territory. It's kind of like our Magna Carta. So, very important for us, Royal Proclamation of 1763, our relationship with the Crown. And then the 1867 British North America Act, Section 9124, the federal government is responsible for Indians and Indian lands. It doesn't say Indians on Indian lands. It says Indians and Indian lands. Okay, further recognition from the Crown about Indians' title. So after the 1867 BNA Act, then I go to the 1870s, this Oral Order in Council. And this is a key one. I don't know, how many people have heard of this one? The 1870 Royal Order in Council. No hands? 2 hands? That's good.
We've got some constitutional scholars.
There's some scholars. That's good.
There's probably some spies back there with dark glasses too. We'll watch out with CSIS people.
Why I'm doing this, Bill, I want to show that there's a legal obligation of the Crown to deal with resource revenue sharing. So I'm trying to outline the basis for it, for my argument. And so after this 1870 Order in Council, and this 1870 Order in Council was this, because Canada was the Northwest Territories. And it was there was a fear that it was going to get sucked up by the states, just like Alaska got sucked up, right? And so they thought the whole Northwest Territories was going to get sucked up by the states. So that they petitioned the British government, and they came back with this decree, this 1870 Order in Council, which basically said when lands are taken up for settlement in the Northwest Territories, it doesn't say Indians or Indigenous peoples, it says the Aborigines. The Aborigines must be compensated on a fair and equitable basis. I'm just kind of throwing my English words in there. I'm ad-libbing a little bit. So that's the 1870 Order in Council. Okay, so I always look to Indigenous peoples in Canada. Chief Laforme, have you been compensated fairly for sharing the Mississauga and Trinity Toronto?
Not even close.
So,
Well, we gave you a lovely dinner tonight, wouldn't you? Let's start. We're just trying to open the door.
so that's the 1870 Order in Council. And then we go to the 1870s and the treaties. And then we have many kind of treaties. Pre-Confederation, Robinson-Huron treaties, Truro Wampum treaties. I'm from the treaty number 4. The Victorian treaties. Alexander Morris was the Queen's Commissioner that came out, met with Little Black Bear. And they made a deal, nation to nation, made an agreement. And our understanding of that treaty was, we will share, Igwa, this much. And what this means is the depth of a plow. Magigwaiuma, nothing underneath, but we'll share this much. And so that's our understanding in our territories, that we're sharing. Okay? And so that's, remember, I'm going very quickly here. That's the treaty understanding. There's a lot more to the treaty. I could spend hours on treaty. But that's one piece as it relates to this resource revenue sharing piece, the treaties. And then in our territory, Saskatchewan became part of Confederation in 1905. Right. And then there was this animal called the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. Okay, there's no consultation or consent from Indian people when the feds transferred to the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, total control in the provincial boundaries of all their territory resource wealth, the NRTA. It was subject to existing trusts.
That was 39.
1930.
Oh.
And that happened because Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta were complaining that, hey, we're not like the rest of the provinces. The original founding provinces control all their land and territory wealth. We want to be like them.
Right.
Put enough pressure on the federal government, and boom, there comes the 1930 NRTA.
So we could have kept that oil out there.
You could have kept all that oil and the potash.
Well, you see,
But that's the 1930. And then, of course, 1982, Patriots Constitution, Section 25 and Section 35, existing Aboriginal treaty rights. So I go by these things here just to show that there's historical and legal obligations to deal with resource revenue sharing, that the Crown started recognizing title to territory and lands, and it's all there. And so when I bring up the idea of resource revenue sharing, there's a legal, historical, and moral obligation to deal with it. And we're saying we don't want it all, but to share, because we're to mutually benefit. And how is it that there's a huge socioeconomic gap that exists in our own territory and homelands? And so this concept of resource revenue sharing is a way to help close the gap. Close that gap.
It seems to me that you're also arguing that sharing the resource also is part of being a partnership, which in turn is about the quality of life on the reserves and how one has a different form of quality of life when you're controlling your own resources and you've got an input and you're not just being treated like, well, here, we'll give you this as a handout.
Mm-hmm. It's a totally different dynamic when that happens.
And do you think that if that happened more, do you think that the expertise that the Indigenous people have over the environment and their understanding and respect for it could be used positively by other people who are exploiting those resources in better understanding how to deal with it in an environmentally friendly way? There are lots of people here that are very interested in the environment. It would seem to me that this could be a partnership that could work both ways here.
Totally. It's a great partnership that could happen. We always say that First Nations people aren't opposed to development. If we have the inherent right to self-determination, that inherent right means the ability to say yes and or no to developments, and that we want to be involved for the wealth creation, the job creation, but it's an added benefit when Indigenous peoples are involved at those tables because of the respect that we have for the land and the water. And that it's really value added when you can involve a First Nations person from start to finish on any project, And a good example why we say this is really buzzing across Canada now is because of the recent Chilcotin decision, the Williams case. You know, where the Supreme Court recognizes existing Aboriginal rights and title, or its recognition. And so my message to the premiers is if you want economic certainty in your provincial territory, if you want economic certainty, you'd better establish processes and tables where you involve First Nations every step of the way, working in partnership. And again, it's not only for the wealth and the job and creation that's going to happen, it brings the added element of respecting the land and water, that we make sure that there's long-term sustainable economic development strategies in place. And that's what it's all about.
When I was in the House of Commons, would have been in the 90s, my seatmate for a couple of years was Elijah Harper. And we had a very exciting evening one evening when we brought in the Yukon land settlements. And I haven't followed that, but do you believe that sort of settlement actually then produced a climate like you're describing here, where people were involved more and more better sharing, or do you know whether or not that's been a success, the land settlements in the Yukon?
To some extent, but the issue with the Yukon self-government agreements is lack of implementation. They don't have a dispute resolution mechanism. So their concern is that we didn't build it into our system, so now what do we do if the Crown side's not properly implementing this agreement we have? They go to court, they go to court, they go to court. Right. And so in that sense, the operative word is lack of implementation. And so we got to really move on that. And so this concept of resource revenue sharing, I'm urging all the premiers to set up tables and processes to begin the dialogue. If you want economic certainty, it's a good thing. And I'm urging all of Canadian people, get behind the concept. It's a new concept. And we say, we don't want it all. We just want to share it. And when you start sharing, it's good for everybody because you close the gap. Further investments in housing and education and training, it can happen. So there's a couple of premiers we have to work on yet. But a majority of them are starting to come around with it. And it's because of the Williams case, the Chilcotin case. It's because of Mikisew Cree, Taku River, duty consult and accommodate, all those things. It's starting to mount up that the judicial branch is saying this. We just need the legislative and the executive branch to catch up.
See, my own native province, if I could use that term, was British Columbia. I mean, when I grew up there, it was very hostile to the type of language that we're presently having. But it seems to me now the climate in British Columbia is quite at least hospitable to the idea that if we're going to move forward, we have to do it on a cooperative basis. Do you think that's largely been driven by these court cases you referred to?
Sad part, yes. Yeah, unfortunately, if we didn't have the Supreme Court decisions coming down, would we really be at the table in some cases? You know,
so this is not a willing political process. This has been driven largely by the courts and largely by the importance of Section 35 of the Constitution. Do you think that's been at the core of that?
Exactly. I believe, yeah.
Section in 82, do you think when they brought the Constitution back and put that section in, they realized the far-reaching consequences it would have?
I don't know. I was a young guy in university in 82. But we still have the dialogue and debate. And we all remember Lord Denning.
I do.
Lord Denning's decision.
Lord. There are lots of law students in here. Remember Lord Denning?
Remember what Lord Denning said in the Patriots Constitution? He says, hey, it's the crown of right of Great Britain, but now the crown of right of Canada. But there's obligations will be met by this crown over here. But if you Indians ever have any problems, we leave the door open for you to come back.
Well,
and that's why we went back to England here to celebrate the Royal Proclamation of 17...
Lord Denning's wig is getting a little getting a little frayed at the edges these days. But there was Mr. Chrétien. We had him here as one of your predecessors. He was, as you know, so regularly there at that time, and it was a very dramatic moment for all of us.
It's like, Bill, with Section 35, the debate will be ongoing about is it a full box of rights or an empty box of rights, you know? And we believe it's a full box, including the full box with the right to self-determination. But if we don't have a process to resolve that and fill up that box, what do we rely on? Supreme Court of Canada, right?
Right.
And that's a costly, time-consuming process. I'd advocate, let's find a process to fill up the box where we have mutual dialogue and a respectful process so it's quicker.
Yeah.
That's what I'm advocating.
Well, now I want to ask you, because this is very interesting for me, from an international lawyer's perspective, because
I'm a bush lawyer.
I know, but but you told me you spent a lot of time on planes for a bush lawyer, and a lot of time in Geneva. There's more bush in Geneva than you're giving credit than you're giving us credit for. And it seems to me that from our conversation earlier about this, talking to you, you see this not only as the Supreme Court of Canada helping define what should be in that box, but also the evolution of international norms, which in turn you would re-import into Canada as saying these are universal rights that have to be enforced in Canada, and we're failing to do so. I mean, we failed to do so, as you said, when you talked about the level of well, we'll come to education later, but the level of societal rights on the reserves and people, how they're living standards. But we go to, from a legal point of view, there's been a lot developed and at the United Nations and international human rights around this very issue. Is the AFN, are you actively working on importing and using those norms as a way to influence what happens in Canada?
Yeah, that's one of my bullets or tools in my quiver that I want to use, my arrows in my quiver.
Right.
And, is the whole international aspect, the United Nations. And when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted, 7 years ago, and you all know, maybe you don't know, but there was 4 countries that didn't really support it initially, And the sad part, the countries were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And eventually they all came on board, And unfortunately their views are they still view it as an aspirational document, and we don't view it that way. As Indigenous peoples, we view it as the minimum standards in international law when it comes to our fundamental rights. And we hold that standard, that high place for the UN Declaration for us. And Canada is part of the United Nations, And now we start looking at the declaration that was adopted. There was a big meeting in Alta, Norway a year or so back that basically worked on an outcome document to look at the nation states for the implementation of the declaration.
Right.
That was dialogued last September in New York at the WCIP, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, when the nation states came together to discuss the implementation of the UNDRIP. And sadly, but there was one country that when it was unanimously endorsed by nation states, one country got up and after the vote made an intervention. Guess what country?
A reservation, basically.
Explanation after the vote, they call it. And there was one country that made an explanation after the vote. It was Canada.
Well,
and
I like to think that wasn't a country, it was a government that chose to do
it.
That was perhaps.
Touché. Good point. And so utilizing the international forums are something that as a national chief I want to keep using, because I can honestly say, and I've been around politics, First Nation politics, about 30 years of my life, and the only time that Canada or any government really cares to listen to us about our issues is when they get embarrassed. And at the international level, I can honestly say that's probably the only time I feel as a leader that Canada listens, or their staff, their bureaucrats, the officials over there listen. What are you going to be saying? Where's your intervention? What's in it? Like they're worried because of the embarrassment. Yeah. And unfortunately for Canada, this is the only black mark on Canada's great reputation, is how they dealt with the Indigenous peoples here, the issues we face. And so I want to keep utilizing the international forums just to mount pressure, and mount pressure that Canada do the right thing, or the proper government do the right thing, the proper party do the right thing.
Right. Well, we won't get into party politics, but I do. No, I think it's remarkable that here we are having a conversation about this issue, which touches so closely into what the fabric of a nation is about, and to realize that you're reaching out into the international community. I mean, at the Summit of the Americas, which I was involved with in the early 2000s with Mr. Chrétien, I mean, at that time we were very proud. We were bringing in peoples from other countries, from Mexico, from South America, and they were looking to Canada for leadership. And now, in fact, we're having to go out to import their ideas of leadership to try and raise our standards. I think that's a very interesting thing, but I think it's wonderful that at least the AFN has got both the expertise and the interest to be able to reach out into the international community. It's such a different world. I don't think 25 years ago people would be doing that. Do you?
No, I think a lot of our leaders and chiefs back in, like the first time that First Nations people went to the UN was 1977. And when they really had to try to have a presence there, they opened the doors for Indigenous peoples. And as Indigenous peoples, we say we have the 5 things in international law that respect or recognize the right to self-determination. We have our own lands, we have our own languages, we have our own laws, we have our own people, and our own identifiable forms of government, you know? And so if we maintain that principle, you know, and we have that inherent right to self-determination, then yes, we should be within the United Nations.
Right.
But as Indigenous peoples, the doors were shut there, you know? And so now it's finally starting to get opened a little bit. Whether you're talking about the declaration, we just finished coming back from Geneva last week, trying to expand the mandate of the MRIP, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you know, trying to work on expanding that mandate.
Right.
We have the permanent forum coming up. We have the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review of Nation States in terms of how they're dealing with Indigenous rights. So all those mechanisms we have. We have the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Different mechanisms we have within the international forum, within the UN. We need to utilize them more effectively. But I can remember a lot of chiefs even saying, oh, why are you going to Geneva? Why are you going to New York? You're just wasting money. You know, it's a junket, you know. Yeah. And really, it's lobbying. It's building allies. And it's important work, but it's slow work. And it's just another arrow in our quiver that we can utilize to help bring about policy and legislative change here in this country, but as well to build allies throughout the world to put pressure on. You know, and it's all about bringing about change, a positive change.
Where are your biggest allies coming from? The American people or the international?
One of our biggest allies, you know, when we made the presentation at the CERD, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Dr. Crinkley from Ireland, she was a big ally. And
really?
Even the United States was an ally because
the
what
Irish.
I mean.
My wife is Irish. This is dangerous territory here.
Well, because they were their official reps, and what we were doing, we were meeting with these reps from Ireland and the United States, and you know the different nation states, their reps, and saying Canada is being called into question. They're going to come into account. I want you to ask these questions to Canada. What's their mechanism to implement Section 35 of their own constitution? You know, where do they have a treaty implementation process in Canada? Do they have a resource revenue sharing process in Canada? Ask them why there's so many missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, and what are they doing? Like, ask them. So that's the kind of lobbying we did. And so why I say she was a big ally, she hammered Canada when so that's why I mean she was.
Well,
that's why
I'm familiar with being hammered by the Irish, but I'm glad I wasn't foreign minister when you were out there causing trouble.
So she's a strong ally.
That's great.
Dr. Crinkley.
Well, that is interesting. Well, you get your allies where you can find them and use them, and I think it's wonderful that you're using every arrow and every weapon we have to use. And we're living in an integrated world. Let's use that as a factor. Mm-hmm. Can we turn maybe to a much more difficult local issue that I know many people here are concerned about? And that, of course, is the alarming number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that we've recently heard about, the number of over the years, but that 2014 RCMP report, you know, pointed out the disproportionately number. And I just wonder if you could share your reflections on that issue, a little bit the causes, What should be done? What is the AFN suggesting would be the appropriate approach to deal with what is a problem for all of us really in our community, and something we shouldn't be tolerating?
No, it's a really sad state. You know, everybody thought there was the numbers when you look at the statistics. There was 600, everybody initially thought, and then with the RCMP report, it's 12. It's probably even higher than that. Missing and murdering Indigenous women and girls. And that happens for a number of reasons. You know, when you look at the numbers and the stats, and we're going to keep pushing for this federal inquiry, no question, to get to the root causes.
Right.
And we know there's lack of housing.
So you don't take, I mean, this idea that this is, I mean, I don't want to get political here, but I mean, the Prime Minister's been pretty clear. This is a criminal issue, not a sociological issue. An inquiry isn't going to go anywhere. You don't see that as a real answer. I mean, you feel an inquiry would be helpful, do you?
It will be. It will be very helpful because of two things. But again, not just an inquiry, but the operative word the implementation of the recommendations that will be forthcoming from an inquiry is going to be very important.
Right.
But having the dialogue and the focus, if the inquiry is brought about and becomes a reality, everybody in Canada will be talking about it, will be focused about it. And that's very important to illuminate and open everybody's eyes to the situation that we're living here in Canada. And a lot of it is for me, it's all about colonization and oppression. It's all about the residential schools, the intergenerational effects of the residential schools, the imposition of the Indian Act, those two things. Between those two things, the residential school system, which broke down an individual, broke down a family, broke down a community, broke down a nation, broke down the self, that everything good about being Indian is no good. Cut your hair, your language is no good, your ceremony is no good, you're no good, you got to follow this way, you know? And then you throw in there mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. You're not healthy coming out of that system, right?
And we're still paying a price for that.
Exactly, the intergenerational effects. And so we've lost the way. Our people, because of that colonization, the oppression. And then the Indian Act comes in, that's a whole other story. But between those two things, you see the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community, the breakdown of systems, the breakdown of lodges, societies. Our whole way of being is broken down. And so it's going to take some time to heal from that. So we see this violence in our communities. We see this, even how people view women. There's racism, there's discrimination, even in the justice system, you know. There's all these things, so we know that. How are we going to deal with it? There's got to be greater investments because there's overcrowded homes, right? You got to deal with the overcrowded housing situation. You got to deal with the need for more detox, safe shelters, daycare, education and training. All those things have to be invested now, you know, in order to deal with that. And we're going to keep pushing for that inquiry because we want that dialogue for people to see that it's not just a First Nations issue, it's everybody's issue.
Right.
And it's right across Canada, you know, and it has to be dealt with. So that's the inquiry piece.
I see what you mean, because if it's just a criminal justice issue and it's in a narrow box, because what you're doing with the inquiry is you're saying, well, we have to look at the root causes of everything and really get to them and really address them if we're going to get to this.
We had the round table, you know, because...
Yes. And what was you felt that was fairly successful? Or?
Well, yes and no. It's a process we inherited, or I inherited, but we had the round table. We hold up the premiers. They're committed to it. You know, so we had four things. We had the adoption of the outcome document, you know, basically to focus on three areas: prevention and awareness, community safety, you know, and dealing with the justice system. You know, so three themes in the outcome document was adopted. Premier Selinger committed to hosting a national roundtable on justice and policing. So thank goodness he survived his leadership bid last weekend in Manitoba. That's a good thing. Right. So we're going to hold him to that. Premier Wynne committed to a national awareness process regarding this issue. And then a commitment again to have another roundtable, an action roundtable. It was basically to be a coordinated action plan to deal with this. And so you've got a federal budget coming down, you've got provincial budgets coming down. What can be invested? Are these governments going to be making those key investments that are needed in those certain areas, like simple things like more daycares, more safe. And it's not just safe shelters for women. Men's wellness centers have to happen as well. You know, it's like a wellness center for the whole family. So it's not just dealing with the women, the men. It's the family. It's the whole unit, the whole.
So there's a legitimate reason why the provinces would get involved, because there's a lot of provincial jurisdiction issues here and provincial responsibilities that cut across the underlying causes of it.
I think once you start making key strategic investments, you're going to see this gap close. Because the simplest way I say it is this way, Bill, is that if people can't get their heads around treaty rights or Aboriginal rights or inherent rights, just get your head around the business case. There's a huge cost to this gap. There's a huge cost to this gap. And there's also a cost of missed opportunities, you know, for these young First Nations. Just think of how much GDP would be added to if these young First Nations men and women were healthy and well-educated and trained to start participating in the economy. So that's why I say embrace new concepts like revenue sharing. Embrace new concepts like key investments in education and training, because that's what's needed to close this gap.
Well, one of my previous visitors here was former Prime Minister Martin, and he was recently quoted in the Globe and Mail, and I know from talking to him personally that he's made this very much a personal drive, and I know you've talked to him personally about it.
He always phones Val.
And oh, good. Well, you'll have more influence with him probably, but I think that he is a very articulate spokesperson for saying this gap is crazy. The fact that on-reserve levels of education are not the same as off and everything, and there's no justification. And I understand that he's trying to go at this from the point of view of teacher training and getting better teacher training. Are you seeing some positive progress in terms of people recognizing that the educational gap has to be met? And
it's starting to happen, but it's slow. And we hold up Prime Minister Paul for his efforts, because he's doing a great job. Even it's amazing. You know, he's not the Prime Minister anymore, but he's still serving people. And we lift him up and thank him for his contributions, because he's pointing out very clearly, and people should know, like, on reserve, it's $6,500 per child per tuition. Provincial school systems, it's $10,500 per child. In the French school systems, almost $20,000, right? So there's a fiscal gap, no question again. You know, and one of the most
strictly the federal government's responsibility, because it should be putting in that, investing in that, because it's its responsibility for the education on the reserve.
Federal fiduciary trust obligations, you know, there's those obligations. Is it a right? Is it in Section 35? You know, why is there discrepancies? Why are there, you know, so there's a fiscal gap, no question. And so we've talked and trying to get a process in place to close that fiscal gap, but as well, there's that whole idea of First Nations control, Indian control of Indian education, you know, and systems.
Was that Bill C-33? Is that what that was turning around?
That was trying to get there, but there's still too much control and power with the minister, still too much control. Like he had, it was like the good old Indian agent again, coming, overseeing things, right? And we didn't want to go down that road anymore. We knew there's a fiscal gap that has to be closed.
Right.
You know, there is a good example is the Mi'kmaq people on the East Coast. They've had a First Nations control system for a number of years. Their graduation rates are higher. You know, they're a good success story. And large part of it is because language and culture is put into the school systems. And people don't know this, but language revitalization is key. Language and identity is key. Because studies have shown that once a person is fluent in their language, you know, and they know who they are, where they're proud of that, they're more successful in school and they're more successful in life. So that study, you know, is very important to get out, and people should know that. Putting the indigenous languages, a revitalization strategy in place nationally in the schools is very key to success. And you can see that on the East Coast.
It shouldn't be difficult for us to accept, given the whole thrust of Bill 101 in Quebec and the whole debate. We lived through a discussion in our generation of precisely that argument of a people that said, we'll be more prosperous and more successful if we have control of our own identity and our language. And you're just making exactly the same argument for Aboriginal peoples.
That's it.
And well then, when the province sort of said I was going to introduce you, and I didn't, let me try now to say you broke through a lot of these barriers yourself as a person. I mean, you grew up Little Black Bear.
Yep.
So how was that? Then your education seems to be a thread through your political life. You end up getting superior degrees at the University of Regina, and then you studied corporate leadership at the Rector's College. Was this a largely self-motivation, or is this something that you were able to get resources and get support from the family and support from your community? Or?
Good question. Well, I grew up on the reserve, and come from a family of 6 boys, right? We're all boys, no girls.
Really?
And
your mother must have had her hands full, but anyway.
yeah, she did. And my dad passed away when I was 17. And my mom basically, we called her the old groundhog because she was born on Groundhog Day. And,
boy, I wouldn't call my wife an old groundhog.
No.
I mean, there's a lot of Irish things, but I wouldn't go there. But anyway.
No. So she was a big influence for sure. And 3 of my older brothers are retired RCMP. So, and one of them used to be undercover. So when Bill C-51 was talked about and CSIS and everything else, I know what these guys can do. So,
Okay.
That's another story.
Yeah, well, I think you should tell that one, actually.
Just be careful.
Okay. We don't discourage the students. It's all right.
No, so my parents were a big influence, for sure. You know, my dad went to residential school, went to LeBret Residential School. And then when he passed away, my mom was very, very strong, just basically pushing about independence. We grew up on the reserve, and I wouldn't say, like, we never had no running water, but we thought all Indians lived like that, you know. When I went to school, and we were bused off the school from Little Black Bear to Goodeve, Saskatchewan. So I always throw the odd Ukrainian phrase every now and then, Yakshamayers, Doja Dobre. It's right in the pierogi belt,
oh,
right?
Really? Oh, really?
Yeah, so I went from grade 1 to grade 9 in Goodeve, Saskatchewan. It's close to Yorkton and Melville, like I say, right in the pierogi belt. Holopche and Perehe. It's pierogies and cabbage rolls, right? And then from grades 10, 11, and 12, went to Bellegarde because we played hockey, and they had a good hockey team, and I was recruited to go play there, and graduated from there. And then went to university for 80 to 85. And
Where'd you go to university?
politics.
In Regina or in Saskatoon?
No, I went to the Indian Federated College, Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. And then they didn't have a degree in business, so I had to move over to the U of R, University of Regina, and graduated there with a business degree in 84, 85. And then worked 2 years in HR, and then got into politics. But the biggest motivation for me was when I went to the Indian Federated College, was having access to the elders, the old people, the wise ones, the teachers. They really got me going on, you know, when I went like this depth of a plow.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about the importance of treaty, the importance of your language and your ceremonies and your traditions. And the biggest thing I can say to young First Nations men and women now is how we need 2 systems of education. And what I mean by that is, yes, kindergarten to grade 12, yes, university training, techno-vocational training on one hand, but on the other hand, just as equally as important is your language and your ceremonies and your identity as who you are and where you come from. And I got that at the Indian Federated College. It's now called the First Nations University of Canada. It's
and where's it located?
It's it's affiliated with the University of Regina. It's a federated college, but we've called it the First Nations University of Canada. And you really
and do people go there from all over Canada?
All over. It really was a national and international institute. It's a place for Indigenous knowledge, and languages is so important. And that really stuck with me, was their teachings. And then growing up on the reserve, just having access to mentors and role models. From File Hills, that's the names of our reserves, like Little Black Bear, Star Blanket, Okonis, Pipixis. We're known as Kiskimanichi in Cree, File Hills. But we've had Noel Star Blankets from Star Blanket. He's a former national chief. He's my next door neighbor there on the reserve from Star Blanket. Walter Dieter, he's one of the founding national chiefs for the Assembly First Nations, National Indian Brotherhood. He's from Pipixis. So from our 4 little reserves, now I'm the 3rd one. So I don't know what it is. Must be the water or lack
Hotbed
of water.
Hotbed of politics and that part. Well,
So
that's great.
that's who I am. That's where I come from. That's what it is.
Well, and that led you then to take leadership in your own band and your own community, which then in turn led you into AFN politics. I mean, or how do you? Is there a natural progression there? Or?
I guess so. When I think of it, and the model that I use, but like I've been at every level, you know, and people are. Do you ever wonder what do we mean by Indian self-government? You know, what are we talking about? You know, and so the model I always use, and when I do these presentations, you know, and start talking about jurisdiction and sovereignty and nationhood, and what are we talking about? And so I do it this way, and here's my flip chart. So I put the Creator on top, and I always say, there's many roads to the Creator. I always say, just get on one, people. Like, get on one. You know, and our elders' teachings that the biggest thing that our elders taught us was that, you know, this Bible way and the church way is a good way.
That's nice. The bishops are here, so this is a good thing. I'm glad they're hearing this.
But they say that was given to them. Our way was this way. And this way is our sun dances, our sweat lodge ceremonies, our pipe ceremonies, our connection to all these things. You know, it's our way to get connected to the Creator. This way is not above this way, and this way is not above this way. That's why I say there's many roads to the Creator. Okay? And so the Creator's up here. Then the people. Okay? And then the people, and I'm just going to apply it to Little Black Bear. The people elect a chief and council. So Little Black Bear Chief and Council is up here. Then Little Black Bear belongs to an agency, the File Hills Agency. And there's 5 reserves that work together, you know, for services and programs. We have our own police service, health, whatever. Then Little Black Bear belongs to a tribal council. And there's 11 reserves that work together. And there's an election there. So the 11 chiefs and councils get together to elect a tribal council chief, you know. And so that's the tribal council. Then Little Black Bear belongs to the FSIN, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. So the 74 Indian reserves in Saskatchewan work collectively together under one political umbrella called the Federation, FSIN.
And is that true of every province?
Nope.
No.
Nope. Nope.
No. I thought it would be too simple.
No. I'll give a breakdown of the other ones. But
oh dear.
So
Don't
now,
tell us about Ontario,
no,
whatever you do.
There's 4 or 5, and some independents. But and so remember, it goes from Little Black Bear, File Hills Agency, Tribal Council, FSIN, AFN is on the bottom, 633, right? So it goes from 1 reserve, 5 reserves, 11 reserves, 74 reserves, 633 communities. And then Little Black Bear entered into Treaty Number 4, okay? Put his 4 I didn't say he signed it. He didn't speak English or French. He spoke Cree. He spoke Assiniboine. So he entered into Treaty Number 4. And we're part of the Cree Nation. Cree, you know. So these are the constants over here, being Cree and to treaty. These other ones over here, you know, are they constant? You know, the people elect the chief and council. So I've been a chief at Little Black Bear. I've been on council at Little Black Bear. I've been a tribal council chief. I've been an FSIN chief. Right. I can't hold a job, right? So
well, it seems you going like this, but I think you've been percolating up, not down, but anyway.
No, but I did that for a reason. We put the AFN on the bottom, not on the top. It's on the bottom. Until we move to one Indian, one vote, because that's an issue. Then you might put the AFN on top, but we're not there yet. So it's on the bottom.
So is that one of the great challenges of the AFN today?
Well, one of the great challenges for AFN is becoming relevant, responsive, and the whole point about urban Indians, off reserve, right? That's the other one. How do we connect? How do we relate? How do we get connected? 50% of our people reside off the res now, off the reserves.
Right.
You know? And so back up to here. And I didn't spend any time on the Indian Act. But the Indian Act controlled our systems of governance, and they imposed a 2-year elective system. And only those normally resident on the reserve get to vote for the chief and council. If you stayed under the Indian Act for electing your chief and council back up here, there's always fights on who should vote, who shouldn't vote. You live in town, so you can't come and vote, and so there's always appeals.
I'm sure.
But remember the Corbière decision. The Corbière decision came down. And basically, that decision said, no matter where you live, you have the fundamental right to vote for your chief and council. Okay? So the chief, that's why the chief's office, Chief Brian Laforme's office, is the highest. He's way up here. And he represents all his people from Mississauga, New Credit. No matter if they live in Toronto, they might live in Montreal, they might live in Regina, Saskatchewan, they might live in Vancouver. They have the right to vote for him. So he represents all his people. Oh, he's gone.
It's all right. He's going to look after his people. Don't worry. Actually, he was worried about those RCMP guys up there. But anyway,
so you
can see, and so that is when I was the member of Parliament. I mean, I think I told you, when we were having dinner that, we had so many issues in the riding, particularly young people and Council Fire and Miswee Beak and a lot of social agencies, and yet all of those different people were coming from different tribes, so they would have had different allegiances to chiefs all over the country, basically. And is that maybe one of the reasons why the voting turnout's so low? And
it's
why
part
you
of
don't
it. That's part of it. One of the when you say the voter turnout, are you talking about federal provincial elections, voter turnout?
Well, I was thinking of my own vote, actually.
Oh,
not all politicians think about voter turnout on their. We felt very strongly that it was very difficult to persuade people to come out and vote. I would go to Council Fire and people say, "Oh no, we're not going to bother voting," and I'd try and persuade them, but it was certainly not a priority of anybody. That's for sure. So
there's a couple of reasons for that, Like we always point out. Well, First Nations people didn't get the right to vote in federal or provincial elections till 1961. Okay?
Really? As late as 61?
61. Deaf the Chief. John Diefenbaker was the Prime Minister of Canada that brought that in.
Really?
So again, sometimes we have this debate along in Indian country about when did we as Indigenous peoples officially become Canadian citizens? When did we become Canadians? So if you had to pick a date, you might pick 1961, when we were given the right to vote. Because how could you be the citizens of a country without the fundamental right to participate and vote in the politics of a country? How could you become a citizen? How could you be considered a citizen? And so we didn't get the right to vote till 1961, okay? And so even in our territory, this is going to be a long-winded answer as to why you don't see a lot of participation by First Nations people in federal or provincial politics. It's starting to get better. So one of the reasons was we weren't allowed to till 1961. Right. That's one of the reasons.
For sure.
The other reason was a lot of our elders and our old people would say, Peetak, be careful. That's their muniao, that's their government. We have our own. We have our own. So don't vote over there. That's going to hurt your sovereignty, your nationhood. That's going to hurt your. We have a treaty with the Crown. We have a treaty. No matter who gets in. Even if...
yeah, let's not go there.
I was going to say, even if this... No, it doesn't matter who... The Crown is supposed to abide by and live up to this treaty relationship we have. Right? And so we have a relationship over here. That's their government. That's not ours. So our old people frowned upon it if you participated in that politics. Mm-hmm. So again, some pressure inside.
You're going to lose your independence in a way. Yeah.
So that's another piece. Then the other piece, the third one, would be just the marginalization. There's poverty. People don't care about whether or not we're going to vote for you or get you elected, because I got to worry about putting a roof over my head. I got to worry about putting food on the table. I got to worry about getting my kid to school. I got to get all these other worries. I got no time to even consider this other stuff out here, right? So the marginalization, right? So there's those three things from the didn't get the right to vote till 61. The whole issue of sovereignty, nationhood, jurisdiction. We have our own system. To the marginalization and not feeling really part of it, But now that's starting to change. I see a change. I'm starting to see more and more people starting to embrace the concept of dual citizenship. You know, whereby I'm always going to be a member of Little Black Bear, I'm always going to be Cree. You know, I speak a little Ukrainian, maybe I'll be a Ukrainian. But
Careful, Putin may hear you, so.
It's good, it's good. Chikai, just wait.
Uh-oh.
And so if we have that, and you embrace that concept, and it's this individual right superseding collective right. It's now my individual right to vote if I want. If you're my chief and you say, no citizen of Little Black Bear First Nation votes in provincial or federal elections because we have our own system of government, I'd say, Chief, you can't stop me. I'm going to exercise my right, you know? And so that concept, that individual right superseding collective right, is starting to come in place, which is fine. But the concept being embraced now is dual citizens, dual citizenship, okay? So that we're not any less if we go and vote over here, because people are starting to realize that things over here, the federal government, provincial governments, are making policies and legislative and decisions that affect us over here.
For sure.
So we better get involved over here,
yeah.
you know? So that seems to be kind of coming around. And if First Nations people get out and vote, we can influence 60 ridings. That's a pretty big number.
Well, and we were saying, I mean, in Saskatchewan, it's virtually half the population of the province. So it's like, it's huge, where the big sociological changes are coming, and people better realize. But I don't think a lot of people realize where we're going. But I think, but you see the AFN at the center of being able to help frame these changes, do you, and direct us?
Or we can be a catalyst or a tool. Like as a national chief, I can't say I'm in with the Liberals or the Conservatives or the NDP or the Greens. Because
well, in 60 ridings, you could maybe.
All we can encourage is the vote to get out.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a big fear for us now of voter suppression with this new this other new piece of legislation. You know, because
this is voter identification.
Exactly, is a huge requirement. And I call it voter suppression, because unfortunately, a lot of our people, there's so much poverty. A lot of them don't even have bank accounts. You know, there's so much people living in the same house, so how are you going to provide that proof of identity on the bill, you know? Like, it's just real pain in the butt to try to exercise your right to vote. So I call it voter suppression.
It's interesting because that's the same debate that's taking place in the United States. In a way, a lot of states are changing their voting rules, in which people are saying a lot of people are being disenfranchised. And they're largely people that are marginalized because of their lack of.
And if it's the first time for a lot of these marginalized people trying to exercise their right to vote, and it's going to be all these hurdles, they're going to get really demotivated. Oh, it's too much of a headache. I'm not even going to wait around here, you know? And so the only thing that we can advocate that I see as part of that process for voting is that the chiefs now can write a letter to each of their band members that are over the age of 18, like to verify that they are a member or a citizen of their nation. So that becomes one piece of ID.
Oh, that's
if
helpful.
the chiefs can do that. And then hopefully most people may have a status card, you know, so they, with your picture. So that might be enough to, I don't know yet, but so we have to work on that. But it really is voter suppression. That's what I think. So we got to work on that and get you reelected.
Well, I'm going to get into trouble here because I don't want to suppress the audience. We've got all sorts of interest in the audience of people who want to ask questions. So we've got about a half an hour left for everybody to get their turn. So yes, by all means, break the ice, as it were.
Dante.
Good.
So my name's Cheyenne. I'm an economist and a graduate of this august institution, and I was the Aboriginal student body while I was here.
Oh, really?
But
breaking ground.
Yeah. So I got excited by a couple things you said, so I was taking notes. Do you support one Indian, one vote for AFN? You mentioned it. You mentioned it as if it were a good thing. Are you going to get in trouble for saying that?
Yeah, I got to be careful here. But I was asked that question in the campaign many times. So, and I went through my situation like this, right? See my flip chart here again? Yeah. If we move to one Indian, one vote, then this moves from here to the top, right? And then it really becomes some sort of a national government in a way. And then the fear is you take away from the office of the chief in council, which is the highest office really, at the community level, So there's that fear. But if the chiefs give the mandate and give a direction to look at that and do that, I'll do that, right? I will.
Yeah, it's a very weird dynamic, and obviously we don't want to get into a conversation with the audience, but I just thought that was interesting. But I actually had one question that was my big question, so I'll just skip to that, which was, if there's an election, a new government comes in, or if Stephen Harper is visited by 3 ghosts in the night, and comes to you and says, I want to get rid of the Indian Act, and I want to replace it with, not just get rid of it, but get rid of it with something that I negotiate with AFN and with all the different chiefs and everything like that. What is your dream of what would replace the Indian Act?
Good question. I would dream of a respectful process and a respectful dialogue that's going to take a number of years to replace the Indian Act. We all want to get out of the Indian Act, no question. It really is a tool that binds everything. But we need a process to get out of it, okay? A respectful process. And because we've got 633 First Nations in Canada, some are outside the Indian Act already through their self-government agreements, and they have their own separate piece of federal legislation in place, right? Really? You think of the 1975 James Bay Agreement, the Quebec Agreement with the Cree. That's one example. You think of the Sea Shelter Agreement. That's another example. The Sioux Valley First Nation in Manitoba just recently got their self-government agreement, okay? So those reserves, those bands, and there's others that are now outside of the Indian Act.
Right.
Because they've got...
It's a discrete whole system for them.
Yeah, because they've negotiated, and so it's taken, in some cases, 25 years to negotiate this new relationship with the Crown. But they've got their own piece of federal legislation now. Yeah. So everybody else is still stuck with the Indian Act. Right. And so now, you can't get rid of the Indian Act overnight. That's why I say my dream would be a respectful process to engage with the Crown, to move towards moving beyond the Indian Act's control. Maybe you look at a Treaty Implementation Act. Maybe you look at a new Self-Government Act that's based on recognition of Aboriginal rights and title because of Chilcotin, as opposed to extinguishment. So it's basically, I'd want a process so that each of those communities, those First Nations, or it might be by nations, it might be by treaty areas, but there's got to be a process because it's going to vary from every province to every province because there's so much diversity. We have to respect that diversity, okay? And what works for the James Bay Cree may not necessarily work for the Prairie Cree, right? Because we have treaties, So basically, that's the way I'd answer it. We need a respectful process to get outside the Indian Act with full, meaningful engagement, respectful as equals, as nations sitting down to work. How do we get beyond the Indian Act? Because it's been there since 1876. It's not going to get done away with in the next 4 or 5 years. We need a process longer term. But let's get out of it. But let's establish the process to get out of it together.
And start. At least somebody has to have the willingness to start.
To start it. Yep.
Great. Yes.
My name is Shakir Rahim. My question for you is, do you think there is a legal and or moral obligation for the Canadian state to pay reparations to First Nations communities? And if so, how would you quantify them?
Answer is yes. How I'd quantify it, I get a bunch of economists together, probably from Trinity.
No, I wouldn't. Oh, dear.
To quantify it. No, it's just basically going back to, and I tried to remember my constitutional rant, from the Doctrine of Discovery and going down to all the constitutional pieces, the 1870 Order in Council. So we believe, again, that there are lawful obligations owed, no question. And the sooner you deal with them, the debt's paid, right? And I'll use land as an example. Treaty Land Entitlement, TLE. In Saskatchewan, that was resolved a number of years ago under, you know, it may not like this, but it was the Tories. It was Prime Minister Mulroney, and the Saskatchewan Premier was Grant Devine. Okay, it was a 60-40 split in terms of the cost, or 70, I can't remember the exact, but there was a cost sharing of the amount.
Brian occasionally fell into virtue.
Yeah. He swings both ways, a little right, a little left. Yes. But I use TLE as an example because it's a lawful obligation, lawful debt on behalf of the Crown. And the simplest way I'll explain it, under treaty, there's a formula. It's 128 acres per individual, 640 per family of 5. Okay? So for example, if I had 100 people at Little Black Bear in 1874, you should get, you know, the 12,800 acres as my reserve, right? Set aside. Say I only got 10,000 acres, so I got shortchanged, right? Okay. So that 2,800 acres is owed under treaty. So that's the name, treaty land entitlement.
But should it go beyond just land? Like, you think the actual, you know, experience that First Nations communities had under the government and all the kinds of discrimination that occurred, like, create an additional obligation beyond just respecting the treaty rights that have been violated and so forth?
You could make a case for that. I was just trying to show through that example this lawful debt of land, and that if they didn't resolve it back in 1993 and 94 when we resolved it, the debt's still lawful and it's ticking. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? To deal with that lawful obligation. Right. The sooner you deal with it, the debt's paid. You know, so the clock quits ticking on it in terms of the debt paid to those bands in Saskatchewan, First Nation Saskatchewan. Your point about is, do we think that it's going to be larger compensation? I'd say we're looking at new concepts like revenue sharing, you know, so we can be self-sufficient.
Yeah, I think that, yeah.
You know, because I don't want to keep burdening, you know, and oh man, those Indians, when is it going to be enough's enough? My tax dollars are going out the door. You know, that rant. No, you know, because we say by sharing the land and resource wealth, you know, we've contributed to the GDP of Canada, you know, and we're saying we just want to share because this gap's too wide. Yeah. So if we can embrace that concept of revenue sharing, getting involved with some of the royalties and some of the developments that are happening, we'll have that money coming directly to Little Black Bear. We'll be able to look after ourselves. You know, self-sufficiency. We can't talk about self-government. I don't even like that word. I like self-determination. I always say you can call a beaver a duck, it still won't fly. You need to start talking about economic self-sufficiency. You know? And so that's the concept of getting involved with the economy, getting involved with new like resource revenue sharing, having the revenues come in directly from what's happening. That's how we're going to rebuild the nation. That's
are the models, there are some models for that. I mean, in the Northwest Territories with the diamond mines and things like that, are they working fairly well? Or
it's starting to, like this concept of resource revenue sharing is nothing new. It's already, it's in NWT. They get 25% of the royalties that are generated from the royalties go to the Indigenous peoples.
Right.
Right? So that's happening up there. Premier Couillard has set up 2 tables, one for resource revenue sharing, one with duty consultant accommodate in Quebec. So I'm asking each of the premiers to set up the proper tables in each of the territories. So that's my response to your point.
Interesting. Yes.
Hi. My name's Diana, and I'm a scientist, so I don't really speak politics, but I think I've made some observations recently that there is a groundswell around Indigenous issues and people paying attention in the general public. But I've also observed that the government in power really has a huge impact on what happens for Indigenous people in Canada, and that without something being a voting issue, that the government isn't going to change how they're behaving. And I think people are learning a lot about Indigenous issues, but I'm not sure that it's on their radar as a voting, something that they will vote about. And I'm wondering if the AFN has a role in making it something that the general public votes on.
Yes. Good question.
How are you going to do it?
No, we want to make all of our issues onto the party platforms, okay? We want to make sure that when we meet with, and I've met with each of them, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Mulcair, and saying, look, here's our 4 or 5 key issues that we want you, if you get in, to start focusing on, you know? And one of them will be, you know, investments in education and training. You know, will you start looking at closing this fiscal gap that's there? Will you start looking at dealing with well, everybody's agreed to the missing and murdered inquiry to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We're making that an issue, right?
That's making the politicians care once they get into office. But
Yes.
how do we make people care about getting the right politicians into office to do that?
That's a great question. If I had the answer.
Brian, scientists are finding it.
Scientists, no. It's basically public education awareness. It's by doing what we're doing tonight. It's by talking and dialoguing. And we can't do anything alone as First Nations people. We need Canadians to get behind these things. We need Canadians to be educated and aware about these things I just talked about, you know? And that's the way to do it. You know, if more and more Canadian people were aware of some of these things like, oh, Indians didn't get a vote till 61, you know, they'd open their eyes. You know, there's so much, we could spend a whole hour just on the Indian Act, even days on the Indian Act, or the treaties and everything else, you know, the impacts of the residential schools. You know, it's so, and so that's the way to do it. Education and awareness leads to understanding, leads to action. So it's dialoguing like this. It's getting these things taught into the school curriculums. And that's the other thing I'm asking the premiers to do. I'm asking them to change every school curriculum in the province of Ontario and Saskatchewan and BC and Alberta to teach treaties and inherent rights and Aboriginal rights. You know, put that into the school systems. Put the residential schools, the impacts of the residential schools and the history of the residential schools and the impact it's had. Put that into the school systems. You know, and I've even asked the premiers to start looking at, why don't you declare the Indigenous languages as official languages of the territory? As a way to lift up instead of oppressing and putting down. They've done that in the NWT. Could happen in Saskatchewan. Could happen in Ontario. So that's how I'm doing it.
Great.
Hi, my name is Miriam Fancy. I'm a grade 12 student, and I work with KI, the reserve in Ontario, called Kitchener-Wabanaki Crucive Inuit. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. But from what I know and I understand is that grade 11 and 12 is not provided on reserve, and that students, in order to go to post-secondary education, which, as you know and as we all know, is a very big thing for any child to go on in their life, how can, as a Canadian, because this is all of our issue, as you said, go to government like the Premier of Ontario and actively ask them and to get grade 12 and 11 for reserves in Ontario or reserves in Canada?
Lobby and write to your member of parliament, no matter who it is, no matter what stripe they are, and say this is an issue. Making sure that those schools in every reserve have K-12 and have the same teachers and the good quality schools, good quality teachers, good quality science labs, good quality computer labs as everybody else in Canada. Because that's not there right now. And so you've got to make that a bigger issue amongst the members of parliament. And that can be done. You know, if everybody would talk to their member of parliament and say, this has to get done. The most powerful lobby group that I participated with in my first 3 months as national chief was being on Parliament Hill with children. But all kinds of children, all colors of children, Indians, non-Indian children, everybody. And what they were lobbying for? They were lobbying for schools on the reserves to be the same as the good schools they have in Ottawa, same as the good schools they have in Toronto, same as, like, they were saying, why is it different? And the kids were saying this, right, on Parliament Hill. Why is it different? That my friend, I want my friend to have the same kind of school, a good school with good teachers, good, clean, healthy schools as we have in our cities. And that was their lobby. That was the kids.
Right.
And they were sending this message to the Prime Minister.
All the MPs.
And all the MPs in Ottawa. So that's how to do it. You politicize it.
What was the result?
Well,
Nothing yet. And Valerie has a comment.
I'm all right.
It's the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society I Am a Witness campaign. So every February 14th is Have a Heart Day.
That's it.
And all the spokespeople on Parliament Hill are children.
That's what it was. And it was very powerful. May not have an impact yet, sir, with your comment, but we'll see. You know, sometimes everything, it's lobbying, right? You're trying to educate and make people aware. You got to make these things an election issue. You know, like education. If we're going to close this gap, there's no better tool than a good education. You know, and that old theme about You open the door to a school, you close the door to a jail. You know, that's what's going to happen.
Good line. Sir.
My name's Sasha. I'm a student in the Ethics, Society, and Law program here at Trinity, and I had a question concerning the missing and murdered Aboriginal women issue, and particularly status of Women Canada's action plan. I was wondering whether you thought that First Nations had been meaningfully consulted on this, and whether it comprised a real response to the situation, or more of just a way to say the government was doing something about it. Thanks.
It's regarding the action plan, the status of women's action plan?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of the action plan, and I'm going to plead ignorance on this one. So, if I was aware of it,
Yeah.
oh, the 25. Oh, you're talking about okay.
Talking about the inquiry?
No. What he's talking about is the $25 million a year, $5 million a year that the federal government is putting towards. Kelly Leach is putting towards this, and I'm saying no, it's not enough. You know, and I've said that publicly. You know, it's not. And we pushed her, like, you need to deal with investments more on, like we say, on home, dealing with homelessness and overcrowded housing, more investments in daycare, simple daycare, even transportation in and out of the north, you know, simple things like that to assist. There's got to be investments in those things. And the $5 million doesn't even cover that, so it's not adequate. And there was no consultation. They didn't phone me. That's what it was.
Right. I think was there a question? Did you have a question?
Huh? So that's what it was.
Okay, good. We've got that one settled. We figured that one out. Thank you.
Question?
George, oh, sorry. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Gabe. I actually work in politics for the provincial government. My question is picking up on the question about schools that don't have grade 11 and 12. And I wonder, questions about sort of jurisdiction. Do you think the federal government has the capacity, regardless of party stripe, to provide adequate education on reserve? Or do you think there needs to be more provincial involvement of, you know, the government that already manages school systems? I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Federal fiduciary trust obligation. Again, Section 9124, there's treaty obligations, there's a treaty right to education. It's the federal government's responsibility to look after that, especially on reserve. So that's where it rests right now. You know, it's a jurisdictional piece, right? But it's the federal crown that has that obligation right now. So on reserve, they've got to invest more. And if there's only schools up to grade 10, a lot of, in the north especially, the kids go for grade 11 and 12, it's culture shock going from the reserve into a center. And they don't have the supports, right? And so it's risky for even going there. So that's a whole. Schools. So I believe the federal government has obligations, both legal, federal, fiduciary, trust obligations, to fund the reserve systems.
And,
you know.
But could they fund provincial, like schools be part of the provincial system on reserve?
It could, but it would need a process to dialogue with the First Nations Chief and Council Education Authority, the provincial school board, and the federal government system. Right? You need a process to get all three parties to the table to try to work it out. I'll use Chief Darcy Bear, Whitecap, Dakota Whitecap in Saskatchewan. They've worked out something between the feds, themselves, and the Saskatoon Public School Board, right? So they've worked it out. It can happen, you know, there are some examples, but we got to be careful. First Nations will argue this jurisdictional piece, you know, and obligations, the federal crown, provincial crown. So we got to walk, if there's a respectful process in place, you can find agreements in certain instances. But in the far north, where the communities are with schools, you know, that only go up to grade 10 and their kids have to leave, there's got to be more investments there because it's just too problematic. You know, there's kids in Thunder Bay that go missing. Kids in Thunder Bay that just don't have the support. It's a culture show. I grew up on the reserve. Like I say, when I went to Goodeve, I didn't know how to flush a toilet. I didn't know what that was, right? Even that was a culture shock. You know, going to Bellegarde was even worse. And it's a small town of 1,000 people. Yeah. You know, think of these young men and women coming from the communities in the far, like there's culture shock. How do you fit in? What kind of supports do they have? That's you know, like how successful they're going to be. You know, so you'd rather keep it in the community. You know, and that's what I think.
George.
Yeah, that's my name. Thanks, Bill. You referred to yourself as, you know, First Nations, Indigenous, Indian, and so on. What are we? What's the word that you use for all of us that aren't First Nations? So anyway, my question has this. My question
this
has
is
this.
a dangerous road we're going down here, George.
No, my question is this: we're talking about two different worlds understanding one another, and in some sense, it breaks my heart when you have to sort of deal through our organizations to get what you need. But my question is, can we go on the reserve, and can we become Cree? Can we vote in your reserves for our leaders? I mean, are we welcome? Is there an exchange that goes that way? You were talking about getting the vote. Does it work the other way? And in trying to understand one another better, is there some way that there's a process in place that I can become a Huron or a Mohawk or whatever?
I'll say, yeah, there is a way. In Cree, we have a word called wahkotuin. I'll make sure I say it the right way, Adelia. Wahkotuin. Making relative ceremony, you know? And so if we adopt you as an uncle or an older brother in Little Black Bear, then we view you that as a relative, okay? And so there is a way. You know, to me, your question would be about how do we learn from each other? How do we grow from each other? How can we, integration can work both ways, you know? I went from Little Black Bear to Goodeve. Why can't the kids from Goodeve come to our school on Little Black, if we had a school, you know? Like to learn. You know, I learned Ukrainian. You know, could they learn Cree? Could they learn the 58 different Indigenous nations languages? So integration can work both ways, and that's a really good way to build bridges between our peoples, you know? When's the last time you had an Indian? Like I use the word First Nations, Indian, you know, Indigenous. Those are the top three now, eh? The words. Yeah, because well, you know, like I'll say it this way as well. In Indigenous persons or First Nations worldview, we really see no color. We don't, because when our old people pray, when they go to ceremony. Whenever you go to a pipe ceremony, they take a long time. They're acknowledging, praying for everything. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that we're the two-legged tribe here. We're the two-legged race, the two-leggeds. Our old people will always acknowledge our relatives, the four-legged ones, the animals. They'll also acknowledge our relatives, the ones that fly. They'll also acknowledge our relatives, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. They'll always acknowledge Mother Earth. And they'll always acknowledge Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. They'll acknowledge the star people, the ones that sit in the east, southwest, and north, those beings that sit there. We're all part of that. And so we're all connected in that way. That's how we view from an Indigenous perspective. We don't see color that way. We're the two-legged tribe. That's how we see it. And so if we have that worldview, we're all related in that way. We're related in that way. And so we can learn, like I say, integration can work both ways, you know. And so I'll share that much with you. But we do have a law, Wahkotuin, you know, making relative ceremony law. And so we can adopt you, you know. And when we adopt you, then you follow our ways, you know, and our traditions, and our practices, and our ceremonies. You know, and the biggest one is like our laws. When we have our law, we have a Creator's law, you know, and so that's what we always try to follow. You know, and so I'll share that much. You know, I can say that much.
Sir, and I think will be the last question.
Okay, I'm sure that there's a great deal more that can be done on the First Native file in a lot of different issues. I would have been happier if I had heard at least a mention tonight from you about the fact that there have been some successful bands that, from my reading, have taken their own life in their own hands and decided they're going to make their own way, and whether they're outside the Indian Act or not. In other words, you know, I think that all of us that are not Indian, we understand, and we're beginning to understand what has gone wrong and what needs to be corrected. On the other hand, it's not as if successive governments, both liberal and conservative, have not spent hours and hours and hours on the Indian file. And God knows we spend an enormous amount of money every year on the Indian file. So what my advice back to a leader of the First Nations is, let's also talk about what can Indians do for themselves. Okay, I don't think the dialogue can be, you know, you talked about the gap. Okay, well, that gap is going to be fixed two ways. First, we've got to have governments, provincial and federal, we've got to do some smarter things. But and it's probably going to cost some more money. But the second way that gap's going to get created is that Indians are going to have to take charge of their own lives, because they're never going to close that gap based on the GDP of Canada if we doubled what we gave. And we give a considerable amount of money every year to the Indian file.
Go.
I'll answer it this way, but thanks for the question. We need to look at the whole point about economic self-sufficiency. And it's, we don't believe governments give us anything. Like, if we looked at from a First Nations perspective, because there's also this dialogue becoming like, the dollars we get at Little Black Bear, if we start talking about our own source revenue, and if we all started talking about, remember I talked about assumed crown sovereignty and jurisdiction over the resource wealth. It all comes down to about land and resources in Canada. That's what it comes down to. And for the last 500 years, we've been marginalized from developing the lands and resources.
That were yours.
Exactly. And so that's why we say we need to start looking at economic self-sufficiency, no question. That's all part of it. And yes, for ourselves, we can do it ourselves if given the chance and the opportunity, right? If we were given the chance and opportunity, we could be developing our own potash mines in Saskatchewan. If given the chance and the opportunity, we could be developing any of the resources, forestry, diamonds, you know, but everybody else is developing them because why? We were kept on the reserve. We weren't allowed to leave the reserve without a permit. We weren't allowed to even participate in the economy without any permit from the Indian agent. So it's the policy. And I agree with you that we have to start assuming things for ourselves. It's called self-determination. But again, the tools have to be there. There's got to be capacity, there's got to be governance, there's got to be access to the resource wealth, you know. And so we can do it. There's no question we can. But it's all about accessing and getting through those hurdles. And again, it's breaking down that thing about, well, we spend a lot of money on the Indian file. Well, from an Indian's perspective, we say, well, so have we. Look at all the land and resource wealth we're sharing, you know. So that's how we look at it. So it's a matter of getting to the table to dialogue. How can we build a better Canada together? Because you're not going anywhere, and neither are people. But we have a fast-growing segment of Canada's population, which is young First Nations men and women. And how do we get them prepared? How do we make investments now? And how do we create a Canada that's respectful of the diversity? You know, that we're moving beyond the Indian Act, we're moving beyond the residential schools, but we have a Canada that embraces that there are 58 different nations. And we're now accepting that the myth that it was founded on French and English is passé, and we're respecting the beautiful French language. Mais oui, la belle France du Québec, je parle français un petit peu. But as well, I speak Cree as well. You know? And so that's the kind of society I want to build, that I want to see for our children and grandchildren, that's respectful of the diversity, that's respectful of all of our languages and nations here. And basically closing the gap. And I say we can do it together, man.
Well, that's a good place to end. Very good. That's a very good end. That's a good way to put it. I want to thank you, National Chief. Chief Joseph Gosnell of the Nisga'a said that success must be defined by those who seek it. Going a bit back to some of the last questions and your powerful answer. And I think, I'm sorry he's not here tonight, but a great friend of this college, John Ralston Saul, has written that book, The Comeback. And the thrust of The Comeback, you could pick holes about this or that in it, but the thrust of it is that there's a new, vibrant community out there that's starting to take control of its own destiny. And you talk about the differences, but you yourself are an example of somebody who came from where you came from, went through the educational process in a way and worked your way through a foreign system to some extent, and are now, as you put it, working with us as a community as a whole of Canada, enriching Canada. And we want to thank you for your life for that. We want to thank you for the work you're doing at the AFN, and we want to thank you for the work that you'll continue to do with the AFN, because we think that that work will be important for us as a community and a country, and we thank you for doing it.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for that. Thank you for the opportunity.
So, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks. It was good.
Very good.